Call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting 133 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, widely known, of course, as the Mighty Ogo, the only committee that matters. Before we start, just a reminder to everyone to keep your earpieces away from your microphones at all time to avoid feedback. We're very pleased to welcome back to Ogo Professor Clark and Mr. Boots. Back to Ogo. We'll start with Professor Clark with a 5-minute opening statement, and then we'll go over to you, Mr. Boots. But the floor is yours, Ms. Clark. Welcome back. We're very pleased to have you back helping us. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be back speaking with the committee. So in 2022, our research team based at Carleton University, and including both myself and Mr. Boots, launched GovCanadaContracts.ca, which is an open access research tool to help people more easily explore the Government of Canada's proactively disclosed data on federal contracting. So that tool provides data on all federal contracts between 2017 and 2022. But our focus in the research paper and in the testimony that we'll give today is focusing just on the IT contracting piece specifically. So I should note that the paper we're presenting and the findings are still under peer review, but we did want to release it while that process is underway, given the urgency of the topic. Knowing that effective IT procurement is key not just to the success of individual digital projects, but also essential to effective modern public administration more broadly, our goal with the research was to better diagnose the extent to which the Government of Canada adheres to widely accepted best practice in IT procurement. We suspected, given previous research and a fairly thick body of anecdotal evidence, that the federal government wasn't following the rules for good IT procurement, but we wanted to test that assumption with stronger data. So to do so, we turned to the Proactive Disclosure of Contracts dataset, which is published by the Government of Canada. A fair amount of work went into cleaning those data, and if you're interested in that, we outline how we did that on our website and also in the paper that we're presenting. So, with that data in hand, cleaned, ready to go, to evaluate it, we created a framework looking at international experience to outline a set of sort of rules for modern public sector IT contracting, and then we assessed the extent to which the Government of Canada follows those rules. So what did we find? The main punchline is that the federal government breaks almost all globally accepted best practice for modern public sector IT procurement. And I'll give a high-level summary here. First, federal IT contracts are generally too big, both in terms of length and dollar value, to succeed. And that conclusion rests on a strong body of evidence showing that for software projects in particular, contracts need to be small to allow the project to adjust based on regular and early user feedback, to avoid pooling risk and dependencies in a small number of large contracts, to make it easy to dispense with vendors that are underperforming, and to open up competition to a broad range of vendors, not just those capable of bidding for and winning large contracts. So despite all the evidence that smaller contracts are far more likely to lead to project success, we find that the majority, 53% of IT spending in the Government of Canada, is allocated to contracts that break the threshold dollar value for likely project success. So that's the first big finding. The second big finding looks at the sort of diversity of the number of vendors winning government contracts, because we know that, like basic economics, the more competitive and kind of pluralistic the market, and the more likely you are to have success in kind of buying. So we looked at the supplier market. We identify a small number of prominent IT vendors, where 3 vendors received over $100 million in contracts annually and make up 23% of government IT contract spending. This is alongside a really long tail of thousands of smaller IT vendors and contractors. We note in the paper that one of the things we can't identify with the data we have is how many of those are those pass-through vendors that you've been looking at in something like the ArriveCAN study. Third, we looked to the importance of building in-house IT expertise, which is something the committee has heard several times. And the reasons that you want to build that in-house IT expertise are so that you can be a smart shopper, you can build in-house when it makes more sense to do so, and that you can kind of hold those contractors to account. We looked at the contractor to in-house staff ratios in this part of the analysis, and we found that the Government of Canada has, in some departments, the number of contracted IT workers greatly outnumber in-house IT staff. There's nuance to explore in what that right ratio is, and I hope we can get into that in our discussions. The fourth finding, and again, breaching global best practice, and in a frankly shocking betrayal of responsible stewardship of public funds, current government policies favor vendor ownership of intellectual property and data and do not prioritize adoption of open source solutions. And this is despite strong evidence showing that open source generates more cost-effective, secure, publicly accountable, and higher quality digital services. So these policies on IP represent a clear recipe for ongoing lock-in to vendors who produce custom software for government, reduce departments' ability to share and reuse software, and likely result in frequent cases where the Government of Canada is paying for the same or comparable software multiple times over. So we conclude the paper with a series of policy recommendations, which are also detailed in a brief that we presented to the committee on an earlier occasion. We also note several limitations to our analysis, which we'd like to really get into today as well, resulting in large part from the limited data we have. For us, this is a really an area that is ripe for immediate attention because, as the committee will know all too well, it's very difficult to get a clear picture of IT contracting patterns in Canada. So this research is one attempt to do that, and we really look forward to discussing our research process, the findings, and their implications with the committee.
Well, thanks very much. I hope when the paper is published, we'll be able to have the two of you back to discuss it in length. Mr. Boots, please, the floor is yours. Go ahead, sir.
Cool. Thanks so much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all of you for having me here. I think it's been about a year and a half since last time Professor Clark and I were here, and it's really kind of you to all invite us back to talk about the research. Like Professor Clark said, I think it dovetails well with a number of the studies that this committee has undertaken, the ArriveCAN study, the McKinsey study, this study on the outsourcing of contracts. And there are themes like the de-skilling of public sector workers, especially IT staff, and the government's dependency on outsourcing and consultants that all kind of connect as like a thread throughout each of these studies, and I'm glad you're doing the work to examine this. Professor Clark and I have spoken here before. She's given a great overview of our research in her opening remarks. All the number crunching, if you want to go back and look at it, is on the govcanadacontracts.ca website, along with a guide to reforming IT procurement that we spoke about on the previous occasion we were here. And the research paper that's just gone in for peer review, that's sort of the final stage of this research, and you can read the preprint version on Professor Clark's website, and yeah, we'll definitely get the final version over your way once it's published. And if the preprint version, if it seems dense, which is classic academia, I'd say skip to the charts. They're pretty eye-opening. On page 24 of the paper, you'll see who the biggest players are in the federal government IT space. And on page 27, setting aside things like software licensing and computer devices and telephones, you'll see the big names, specifically in IT consulting services year by year, which is, I think, of particular interest. And I think the main takeaway is that situations like ArriveCAN aren't an isolated case. What we're looking at are systemic issues in how the federal public service conducts IT procurement work. And looking at the research landscape and at other jurisdictions, it's clear just how much Canada has fallen behind our peers. The policy recommendations that we put forward at the end of the paper, they aren't that earth-shattering. They're basically best practices that other governments around the world have been doing for years. And the question is, why haven't we made any progress on them in the Canadian federal government? There have been some kind of like baby steps over the past year or two. This committee's work probably helped move some of those forward. There's updated guidance on procurement that isn't bad, but it's very timid. And there's new, attestation requirements for business owners and Treasury Board policy. Those take effect in September. But ultimately, the interventions that we've seen from the federal government over the past year, including this latest edition from September, they amount to basically follow the rules harder. And there's a great piece from Paul Craig, who's another government technologist, on his website, Federal Field Notes, that talks about why this isn't good enough. Here's what we haven't seen: fundamental changes in process, regulatory or legislative changes around procurement, or efforts to make procurement simpler and easier for small companies to be part of. Follow the rules harder isn't a viable strategy when part of the problem is that there are too many rules. And this creates a lopsided environment where the only companies that can win government contracts are ones like GC Strategies, but also like really large consulting firms that specialize in navigating complicated procurement processes and in building relationships with public sector IT executives. That's what they're good at, and that's why they win contracts. They don't win because they're good at building technology products, which is partly why we often have so many IT failures. And then on the other hand, from the public service side, if you're a senior IT manager or a senior public service leader, going to go work for a large consulting firm or IT vendor is a frequent post-retirement career strategy. That's something we've heard anecdotally quite a bit, which means that no one involved is incentivized to change the system. Ultimately, what the IT procurement system does best is shovel taxpayer money towards large established vendors and IT consulting firms. And that's what the policy on title to intellectual property arising under Crown procurement contracts calls economic growth and job creation, which is why vendors are supposed to own the IP for software that they create for the government, which is truly astonishing on multiple levels. Producing good software and effective government services is a secondary priority, and that's a major problem. And the effects of that show up years later in the frankly mediocre and unreliable government websites, software, and services that we see across the federal public service today. Follow the rules harder isn't going to work. What does it take instead? It takes a dramatic rethink of how procurement works, a dramatic rethink of how the public service handles tech talent, a dramatic rethink of governance processes, policies, and oversight mechanisms. I can list off a whole series of examples of these if you'd like in our discussion today. Ultimately, though, I'm not confident that the federal public service is internally capable of the kinds of dramatic rethinks that are necessary. It's possible that an external independent review, some future Royal Commission on the Public Service could, and if those bodies were to do their work well, most of their recommendations would involve getting rid of things, getting rid of processes, getting rid of rules, getting rid of all the barriers to doing good work in the public service, to, getting feedback and making sure it can get to decision makers, to actually learning and reacting and building things quickly enough for it to matter. Within the federal public service, there are people doing tireless and inspiring work everywhere. I'm really grateful to have worked with many of them. They're held back by outdated processes, old technology, and overly traditional ways of working. And really, in the IT field especially, contractors and consultants don't face the same barriers, even though all those barriers are self-inflicted by the public service on their own staff. And it's easy to be a critic, especially now that I've left the federal public service and I work for a territorial jurisdiction. But ultimately, what I want is for the federal public service to be excellent. It could be so much better, and Canadians in need depend on it. So really happy to chat and looking forward to your questions. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Boots, and same invitation to you. I hope we'll see you back once the paper is published. I have you both back, as well as the other two people from Carleton who assisted you on that. We look forward to it and sincerely appreciate you taking time to help out OGO and Canadian taxpayers in the end. We'll start with Mr. Brock for 6 minutes, please. Go ahead, Mr. Brock.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to welcome both Professor Clark and Mr. Boots to the Government Operations Committee, also known as the mighty OGO. So I'd like to frame my first round of questions to you that it's basically guided by two news articles that I was able to research. One from the National Post, written by Christopher Nardi, which I understand resulted in an interview between Mr. Nardi and both you, Ms. Clark, and Mr. Boots, as well as a policy option piece that both of you authored, dated February 16, 2024. But I guess I'll start by making an obvious assumption that the ArriveCan scam, debacle, however you want to frame it, certainly didn't come as a surprise to you. To you, Ms. Clark, Professor Clark, and to you, Mr. Boots. Would that be a fair statement to make?
Yeah, I think that was sort of the premise of the policy options article, was that this is something we should anticipate.
Right. And we all know what the Auditor General had to say about the whole situation. It was a clear picture of mismanagement around the app. She's guessing at the cost of the app, which we believe to be just shy of $60 million, could be much higher. But we don't have the proper documentation. The departments were so rushed and hurried to put together the app, they did not retain proper documentation. And I guess to you, Professor, and to you, Mr. Boots, that brought to mind the challenges of improper documentation that you found in your 2022 research paper. So the first question I put to you is, this is based on the policy options piece. You said that what could be done with respect to these findings? A response from the government is to simply add more rules, more oversight mechanisms, and more internal processes to prevent scandals. But following this age-old pattern will ensure that failures like ArriveCan and its IT scandal predecessor, Phoenix, continue. Can you elaborate on that for me, please?
Yeah, and this echoes a lot of what Mr. Boots offered in his opening remarks. There has been a tendency, I think, historically in the Government of Canada to layer on more rules and oversight to create new parliamentary officers, new kind of external scrutineers when there's some sort of a scandal. And while, of course, like, we're clearly not advocating for no rules, and in fact, you know, the research in clean, high-quality IT procurement focuses a lot on like what the guardrails should be and building a culture of responsible public service around that to avoid things like conflict of interest, for example. But I think that habit that we've had in Canadian public administration to layer on more rules as a way of ensuring accountability has actually had this perverse effect of undermining accountability and seriously undermining the effectiveness of public servants. So there's, you know, tons of examples that you can find. You know, a classic one that people love to talk about maybe 10 years ago was when the federal government first started using social media, and there were, you know, in some cases, these 20-step approval processes to release a 140-character tweet. You can also look to the Federal Field Notes website written by Paul Craig that Mr. Boots referenced to find some great examples of this sort of internal administrative burden. In one case, documentation required to publish a 5-page website basically was like had more words than the entire edition of The Great Gatsby. So, like, we mire public servants in so much rules and compliance and the reporting burden, which is really well documented, not just in IT but across the study of Canadian governance. And so it has two effects that are relevant to this question of IT contracting. One is it means when it makes sense to build in-house and to try to adopt kind of modern service design practices like user research, agile, multidisciplinary teams, public servants actually can't. It's like really difficult to do the right thing. We add so many rules that they can't be sort of nimble enough. So streamlining those rules would, I think, create space for public servants to do some more of this work internally. But the second piece of it is that when you have those rules in place, it actually becomes difficult for vendors in some cases to work in modern ways with the federal public service, because there are tight rules around things like project gating or the way that money flows, because they can't pull together a multidisciplinary team of internal public servants because HR rules don't allow it. So that's why I think the focus on kind of this latest spotlight on the problems of IT contracting should meaningfully lead to like a reset of policy with a focus on kind of enabling good public service and focusing on what matters, which is like the conflict of interest and the, you know, responsible bidding processes, not creating documentation burdens for public servants. That's not going to help. In fact, it'll make it worse.
Thank you for that thorough response. Mr. Boots, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, if I could just build on Professor Clark's remarks, I think the pattern that you see in a lot of public sector IT work is, if you imagine a large project that has 100 public servants working on it, 90 of them will be writing Word documents that are, you know, project management, oversight compliance reports, all sorts of things that are not actually building the software. If you've got 100 people and only maybe 5 of them are actually writing software code, configuring systems, that's a really odd ratio that is very normal in public sector IT and just completely foreign if you worked at Shopify or Google or another mature tech company. And so trying to reduce those barriers that public servants face with oversight and compliance mechanisms that are really outdated means that you could spend less money having 90 people write meaningless Word documents and having more people actually build software code. And I think one of the sort of understated scandals of public sector IT is that it's very, very normal for the public service to undertake a $100 million IT project that could have been done for $10 million, or a $30 million IT project that could have been done for $2 million. And so this expectation that it's normal to have a $50 million IT project to build, you know, an online forum or an interactive website that could have been done for a fraction of the cost. And there's some really great writing from Waldo Jaquith, who's a technologist in the United States, that talks about how software is so much cheaper. It's not free, but it's much, much cheaper than public sector organizations expect. But the tendency is to say, oh yeah, this project that's, you know, is kind of similar to this previous project our department did. The last one was $50 million, so this one's probably $50 or $60 million, when a really strong team could have built it for $2 million. And that's something that is tricky to sort of dig into, because it all has to do with how public servants are doing the work of IT projects, where 90 out of 100 people are just writing
Mr.
Word
Boots?
documents instead of actually building.
I'm afraid I have to interrupt you because we're past our time, but perhaps with Mr. Jouari's round, you can continue. Go ahead, Mr. Jouari.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome back, Professor Clark and Mr. Boots. Good to have you here, and thank you for being open to share the report that you're, or the paper that you're preparing that's under peer review, and thank you for acknowledging that. Naturally, I was very interested because my background is in IT and is consulting and is delivering transformational large projects enabled by technology. So I was very, very keen when I saw the report. I looked at and I listened to your opening remarks, which you focused on four key areas, and you opened up by talking about government IT projects are too big and for too long, and you suggested it should be shorter and it should be much smaller. And so why is this the case, and what's the best practices?
So to understand, is why is it the case that smaller is better, or why is it the case that they're so?
That the government of Canada have you looked into the why government of Canada projects are so big and it takes too long?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I mean, one of the reasons that public servants will often offer up when explaining why contracts are so big, one is what Mr. Boots referred to, that there's sort of a habituation to like large scale projects, and under like a misperception, frankly, that we need to be spending in the tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars. In some cases, I think that there are vendors that the federal government is sort of used to turning to, and those vendors know that they can charge those amounts of money to deliver on these projects. I think and this gets to the question around sort of what the rules are. I mean, partially the administrative burdens internally imposed on public servants to put up a request for proposals and to go through a contracting process are so high that you can be incentivized to go big, because you're like, well, we want to get as much money as we may need for this project, and we don't want to have to do it over and over again. So reducing those internal burdens would be a really big driver of incentivizing smaller contracting.
Yeah, so you talked about those, reducing those internal barriers. So is it possible that they make the scope so big because the transformation that's needed is so big after many decades of, lack of investment, that the government is trying to move the needle so far to the other direction that they believe that this could be this massive IT transformation that we have to do. Therefore, if we're going to go and we only got, for example, 4 years to do it, let's go big and let's go complex and let's get it done. Is that a possibility?
It might feel, I think that there's an intuition and a sense that that's the way to go, but the data are extremely strong, showing that software projects should really not exceed, the limits that we give in our paper, which borrows from the U.S.'s General Service Administration suggested rule, is sort of max $2 million U.S. a year, no more than 3 years, and no extensions beyond that. And the reason that software projects in particular demand that small scope relative to, say, like big infrastructure projects or something, is that when you're talking about building software and services that are built out of those software, you don't really know what you need until you test early with users. So, there was a shift in how we thought about software development in the private sector with what's called the Agile Manifesto. And this you can find online. It's a sort of and it changed how the private sector and how leading public sector jurisdictions think about software projects. You start small, perhaps with many contracts at once, and you're bringing these vendors together, in part because you're not pooling and making tons of unfounded assumptions about what the end product is going to be. Now, to enable that way of contracting, you have to look at how money flows through Treasury Board, how budget submissions are done. You have to create create space for public servants to get that early feedback and adjust. But it's happened in many other jurisdictions. It's really remarkable how far behind the Government of Canada is in moving their software development practices to what is like well supported in the data in both private and public sector corporations. As you got to keep it small and test and adjust as you go.
So personally, I understand the concept of a roadmap. Usually roadmaps could be anywhere from 2 years to 5 years. I get that. I understand breaking the project into breaking that roadmap into much smaller projects, anywhere from 6 months to probably 12 months maximum. 9 months is the average. I get that. But around the scope and the dollar value, when we're talking about $2 million, and if it's an application that's going to get rolled across the government and at least 23, 24 departments, if you do the simple calculation, you know, I'm not sure whether $2 million is the really the right number or a benchmark. What are some of the other best practices that probably we could use as a benchmark to improve our procurement process, so we don't get caught into, for example, one of the we don't get caught into pass-through situation, as you called it?
Yeah, so I should clarify. It's not that an individual project or initiative would only cost $2 million a year over 3 years. We know you can't like revamp and upgrade all of the benefits delivery programs, which is currently underway for $6 million. But it's that individual project components and those individual contracts shouldn't exceed those amounts. And part of this is just that if a vendor underperforms, you can say bye-bye very easily, right? You're not locked in. And you also create scope to change what the deliverables are by having the opportunity to create new contracts as you go. So it's by no means is it saying that you can deliver some of these large projects for that low dollar amount. It's that individual contracts shouldn't exceed that amount. And so this is where the idea of kind of modular contracting comes in, of bringing together kind of smaller pieces of a project and putting it together. Sean has, I don't know if I'm allowed to pass it to Sean, but he has lots to say about this because I know he's thought quite a lot about how to implement modular contracting. Sean, did you want to add ideas to this?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Boots, let me interrupt. We are past our time, but I'm letting everyone go, as you can see in the first round, just because the answers are so interesting. If you could keep it to about a minute, Mr. Boots, but I'm sure we'll be able to get back to you.
Sure thing. Yeah, just that modular contracting is the idea that you should break large projects into smaller ones. And often, especially in the public service, procurement folks will hear this and immediately think, it's contract splitting, this is illegal. And really, contract splitting by definition means breaking things into smaller pieces with the intention of getting just under regulatory or disclosure thresholds or contracting thresholds. Modular contracting or unbundling contracts means breaking into smaller pieces so that it's more likely to succeed. The intention is different, and by definition, it's not contract splitting, which I think is something people often miss.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. Clark, Mr. Boots, thank you for appearing before us. A bill was tabled, one that would protect whistleblowers in the public service. Now it's before the Senate. In your analysis, did you notice cases of fraud that had been whistleblown? Did you have to look very hard to find cases of fraud?
Ouais, selon nous, si je peux commencer.
If I can start. As far as I know, we never received information from public servants who were whistleblowers. We always hear about projects that were going not very well. And we hear about these things from our IT colleagues. But no one whistleblowed anything directly to us. I'll move on to my second question because given that I have to provide context, my questions will take a while. In October 2023, we heard that PSPC was hoping to expand access to contracts, all while providing the best value for Canadians. PSPC was also supposed to set up procurement processes that would be in line with transparency needs. They would take care of oversight requirements as well. At the same time, the Treasury Board admitted that it was not carrying out oversight about whether the departments were respecting policies. they said that deputy heads would be in charge of providing oversight. So it's the individual departments and the Auditor General who carries out oversight. Here I will connect it to the IT Technology Procurement Guide published in October. And I have some questions about analysis and transparency within the Federal Public Service. I have questions about whether departments are actually carrying out the oversight they're supposed to. I get the sense that everyone is working in silos. At the end of the day, are the government's analysis tools actually useful? Or should methodology be completely overhauled? Well, that's outside the scope of our research project. There's often the perception out there that if the Treasury Board makes new rules, and I worked at the Treasury Board for a number of years, there's a perception that these will trickle down smoothly to the public service. But there's actually a years-long lag time. It can take years before Treasury Board policies trickle down to actual practices. I think public disclosure could change things. So the best thing to do would be to improve disclosure and improve proactive disclosure. Those things could lead to positive change. Outside of that, I'm not sure that the government's tools will actually make a difference. There's this phenomenon that when too many people know what's going on and that there's a problem, no one does anything because everyone assumes that someone else will act. We've seen this in cases of murder and rape where a whole building witnesses it and everyone assumes that someone else will react. It can be the same thing with procurement. There needs to be analysis and there needs to be oversight, but everyone has the impression that someone else will act. Am I mistaken? I think you are right on the money. With mega projects and large-scale projects, responsibility is spread so thinly that it's easy to say. Is anyone else seeing this? Thank you. My final question is for Ms. Clark. Canada has announced the largest number of employees in the public service in history, as well as the largest amount of outside procurement. In your paper, you list the ways that the government was trying to make its own employees more specialized. For example, the Canada School of Public Service and other training methods. What explains the fact that despite the fact that the government is trying to make its employees more specialized, we are still turning to outside providers at such an alarming rate?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think the fact that side by side a growth in the public service, which is in part, in line with growth of the population, but also is a significant, percentage jump, which has been recorded in several media articles, alongside this, especially in the IT space, great growth in contracting should raise questions about, on the one hand, I suppose you could say, are we doing so much more in government right now, more ambitious programming, more ambitious policies that you need more people? That could be true, and I think there's a debate to be had about whether that the amount of contracting and the growth in staff is justified by sort of the ambition of the government's agenda. On the question of sort of the internal capacity building piece and why that hasn't perhaps displaced the need for contracting, that's such a good question. And I think, the Canada School of Public Service does what it can to retrain and upskill public servants, but there's no mandatory training right now in modern procurement practices, even for procurement officers. This is something the Auditor General has identified as a problem. But certainly senior leadership across the federal government has been, they've risen through a system in which they were never asked to understand technology. And in fact, often what I hear from public servants when I interview them is that senior leaders would like to insulate themselves from tech projects because they know they so often fail. There's a kind of learned helplessness and a willful blindness to these problems and an assumption that the IT community will handle it. But we don't tend to raise IT experts to the position of deputy minister, for example. This is more of a, you move up through the policy ranks. So we have this cadre of senior leaders who have power and influence and who are responsible for a lot of this oversight, who sign off on things like big IT contracts, who aren't getting that mandatory training to be good stewards and understand the basics of technology. Other jurisdictions are focusing on that, the executive ranks, and it's something that we could think about doing better in Canada as part of sort of mandatory deputy minister training.
Ms. Blaney, welcome back to OGO. Floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. It's very good to be here. And I really want to thank both our witnesses for being here and for your testimony. And I will admit to being very frustrated listening to this. I, before this work, used to run a nonprofit organization that had federal funding. And I remember having to define what office supplies were. And if I bought anything outside of the definition that I had provided in my application, I would not be reimbursed. So when I hear about people getting tons of resources with so little oversight, I just find it very shocking and frustrating. So my first question is for Ms. Clark. When you appeared before the committee in 2022 to discuss the ArriveCAN debacle, you said that this was a pretty standard story, and you've said that today in your testimony as well. So I'm just wondering, we've heard from the Auditor General and the Procurement Ombud, who sees this as a systemic issue in government contracting. And when the Procurement Ombud spoke to the committee about his report on the McKinsey contracts, he said, I do think that now is the time to act. We really need to reconsider federal procurement in its totality. I'm fearful that if I don't start acting in a more aggressive manner, significant changes will not come. I don't think Band-Aid solutions are the answer. I think there needs to be significant rethinking as to how federal procurement is done. Do you agree that the government should take a more aggressive government-wide approach to overhauling our procurement practices? And if so, what would be your recommendations for the overhaul? And have those recommendations changed from all of those that you did provide to the committee back in 2022?
I'll focus on the IT procurement piece specifically because sort of the broader procurement reforms in the Government of Canada, there's a lot of different pieces there, from like ships to, procuring gardening services. But in the IT space specifically, absolutely more aggressive action is needed. I think it's funny. On the one hand, Mr. Boots and I have said several times that there are too many rules and we like to add rules and kind of burden public servants. But we also do a lot of like soft rules as well, suggestions that don't really have much teeth. And I think if we want to see behavior change across the public service, not just on IT procurement, but more broadly in how we conceptualize sort of digital service projects, we need hard rules. We need to force change because it's the socialization to the status quo and the incentives to keep that status quo as is because of the lucrative potential future consulting opportunities are just too high. So some of the things that could be done that would give more teeth to the kind of suggestions we have right now, the digital standards, which have been around, I mean, Mr. Boots would know better than I because he was working on those when they were developed, but they come out of Treasury Board. They say all the right things. These are exactly, it's talking about keeping projects small and working in the open and using open source. But there are suggestions, and I would guess that most senior leaders have no idea those exist. Those are a thing that live on the Treasury Board website. Make them mandatory. Make it that you can't get money for a project unless you demonstrate how you're adhering to the digital standards, which includes things like doing early user research, getting software code in your hands early. This will affect internal development of software, but it'll also affect how you procure because those partners will know we need to show that we're adhering to these modern practices. So I think that's one area. we talk about spend controls in the paper. This has not been every government's approach, and it's worked well in the UK. I think our situation is much like the UK looked in sort of 2010 before a real kind of revolution. The conversations you're having here now at the parliamentary level were happening at the parliamentary level in 2010 in the UK. That's why they bound ahead as a digital leader, because of the kinds of things that resulted from that parliamentary inquiry. One of them was spend controls, which basically said that with very few exceptions, there was a cap on how big any given IT contract could be. This is like a hard rule that will force public servants into good behavior. And over time, there might be room to soften these rules if needed, because there are some jurisdictions that talk about wanting to have more flexibility and that spend controls can be rigid. I think right now we need to force good behavior really hard. I think the other thing would be in sort of management accountability frameworks, to have actually hold senior leaders to account for how they manage IT projects and get them, focusing on this as the kind of the KPIs that they really care about. That's another kind of way to try to, I think, force some change. But what we're seeing now, which is sort of soft and largely unread Treasury Board guidelines, the handbook on contracting that was released in the last year or so, I believe, largely in response to the work you're doing, is similar. Probably no one has read it, and there's nothing in it that changes how you actually have to manage a project. So we say the right things in Canada, but then we don't actually force public servants to do those things, and that's kind of the problem.
And so, in your response to me, you talked about some rules, and then you're also talking about letting go of some of the rules because it is so heavy. So I guess my question to you is how do we analyze that, and how do we bring the expertise in, I guess, in-house, it sounds like, would be the best way to do that, to actually analyze what is helpful and what is not helpful so that we can make that process more affordable, less taking of money that is taxpayer money, and really looking at having that information available in a way that's accessible for all size of organizations.
Yeah, I'm glad you put it that way, because there is, to clarify that, so there's some rules that need to be streamlined and removed, and then there's others that need to be added, right? And so it's a complicated process. What should be streamlined and removed? There's already been quite a lot of work done on this by public servants. Internally, there was a red tape reduction report, which you can find online, and which I'll make sure the committee has, gets the link to via the clerk. These were public servants' testimonies about the ways they need to see procurement rules, HR rules. I'm trying to think of the other. Maybe there was something around communications. Basically, where they see significant barriers to their ability to be efficient and innovative that are just imposed on them by rules that don't add any value and that distract them from doing the good work they want to do. So that would be a great place to start, I think, to streamline these rules. Taking a hard look at the Treasury Board policy suite, which is largely incomprehensible. There's nothing. There's nothing more disabling to your action than following those rules or trying to understand those rules. It's years of drift of adding new bullet points. The number of you can be in section 10.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, and you're reading to try to understand, whether or not you can, adopt open source or something. These things are not enabling. That's never been their objective. Their objective is, and I'm going to use a rude word here, but it comes out regularly in interviews with public servants, which is that internal rules are meant to cover your ass. They are not meant to lead to good outcomes. I hear this constantly from public servants. That exact line, when I did my PhD research, came up so many times that I had to note that as a remarkable finding, the amount of times that particular phrase was used. So this is shifting the accountability culture to one where the focus is on accountability for results, accountability for learning and iteration, versus accountability by we followed all these rules, we did all the documentation, we produced something that didn't work, but, at least Treasury Board is happy. And that's sort of obviously what no one wants, including public servants, because that is deeply demotivating as an accountability model. So, yeah, those are some places to start, I think. But Mr. Boots probably has lots of thoughts on, as someone who's lived that experience in Treasury Board.
We're about 2 minutes past our time on that, Mr. Boots, I'm afraid. We'll have to get back to you. Colleagues, we've run quite a bit over on the opening round, which I'm frankly happy with because the answers have been incredible. But going forward, can we please leave a lot of space if you have an open question to Professor Clark or Mr. Boots, leave enough time for them to respond. Mr. Barrett, the floor is yours for 5 minutes, please.
Your study outlines a concerning picture of IT procurement practices within the federal government. You've mentioned that nearly a quarter of the $20 billion spent on IT contracts has gone to 3 firms. A quarter of $20 billion going to just 3 firms. Can you elaborate on how the government's failure to diversify its suppliers has led to higher costs and less innovation for the IT systems?
Yeah, I think that the kind of connection there is that for a whole bunch of reasons, certain firms are kind of have an incumbent advantage. Often, because the process is from the external, sort of from the perspective of those bidding for contracts, because there are so many hoops to jump through, it can be difficult for smaller firms to bid. So you end up in a case where you set up sort of the big firms to continue to get contracts. And so, why does that lead to lower quality outcomes? Is that the idea? Okay, I mean, part of it is just the basics of, not being able to force sort of competitive pressure against these vendors, because they're going to keep winning these contracts, whatever the outcomes, really. I mean, and it is remarkable how often, despite project failure or underperformance, these contracts might still be issued to those vendors. Part of that is we don't have a clear way of assessing what project success looks like. We don't have strong data on and proactively disclosed data on whether or not a project led to a good outcome. And that's something that we couldn't determine from our data. We can see how much we spent on contracts. We don't even know what was produced from that. And this is a really common phenomenon. In interviews I've done with U.S. public servants, the same conversation comes up, that there's sort of a small cluster of 3 to 5 big firms at any given time. And sometimes it switches who's in the lead, but roughly, 3 to 5 different firms. And they'll move from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, delivering bad projects, and they keep getting hired, in part because no one's talking about it and no one's disclosing it in ways that make sense.
So I want to pick up on 2 things there. The first is you talk about how larger companies seem to just perform better in terms of their success in achieving contracts. But we've heard that a company like KPMG, which is massive, was instructed by the public service to be a subcontractor to a firm that is objectively tiny, in GC Strategies, 2 people. So how is that possible when, for all of the reasons that you said, it's true that larger firms perform better? How do we end up in a situation where we're using a firm that doesn't add any value? Its supposed value is to source expertise, to source resources, but instead costs the taxpayers 30%, up to 30% more. But KPMG is a known commodity and is the heavy hitter in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I should really clarify. I think those big firms perform better in winning contracts, but they don't perform better in producing good services.
Yeah, 100%.
So that's that key to get it, to clarify. And I know you know that, but I just wanted to make sure I was being clear. How can something like GC Strategies arise? I agree that it is, and all the information we've been learning is that it's surprising. It's not surprising, but it's shocking and concerning. I think part of it is just that we don't have that strong culture internally of scrutinizing value for money when it comes to these contracts. And there's we're habituated to simply kind of trust, I think, that the firms that are winning the contracts are going to deliver. I think the Auditor General, in the case of ArriveCan in particular, also just highlighted basic breaches of responsible public service, right? So I think there's also that piece. And I will say that in interviews that I've done across a whole range of countries that are really leading in digital transformation, they are not worried about their relationship with vendors. They always say, we manage that because we have good internal rules, we have good organizational hygiene, we have sufficient IT expertise to hold them to account. So they would never fall for an a GC Strategies type scam, because they put those conditions in place. And they also really always emphasize that these things happen in a culture of strong ethics and values.
Very, very quickly, would you say that there is a correlation between the lack of accountability that we see and the diminishing role that ministerial accountability plays? The ministers are supposed to be responsible for their departments, but that seems less and less true all the time.
Oh, this is,
Only time for yes or no answer, I'm afraid.
Okay. It's complicated, but I love discussing ministerial accountability, so we should do this more.
Thanks. Mr. Naqvi, welcome back to OGO as well. The floor is yours for 5 minutes, please, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and really happy to be back at OGO to discuss a really, really important issue around procurement. In fact, as I'm listening to both our witnesses, I was having a moment of deja vu in terms that in my past life, used to practice procurement law, being from Ottawa. And so a lot of the issues, and we're talking about almost 2 decades ago now at time, a lot of the issues that are being discussed is something that I recall quite vividly in terms of contracting, decision-making, those manuals that Professor Clark's been talking about with subpoints, and trying to interpret as to what all these rules mean. And then, very similar in perhaps one could argue in other levels of government as well, whether it's provincial or municipal, because from my time in provincial politics, being a member of the Treasury Board, again, having very similar conversations with officials around IT procurement, what went wrong, why it went wrong, why is it over budget, why is it not producing results, etc. So this is not something new. So I'm more interested in not exploring the problem, but more exploring the solutions as to how can we improve our system so that we can get better value for Canadians and a better product as well. So we've been talking a lot about your research and what you have found, though I do want to add that it hasn't been peer reviewed yet, as I understand, and that process is ongoing. So I'm sure that's going to make it even stronger. But can we talk a little bit about what you found in your experience looking at procurement systems internationally? For first part of the question there is, did you find that there are similar challenges when you're looking at United States, European Union, sort of, like countries, Germany, France, Australia, US? Did you find they had similar challenges? If so, if you can summarize them for us. And can you talk a little bit about solutions? What kind of changes, if any, are being orchestrated in those jurisdictions that we should be looking at in terms of recommendations and the work that this committee is doing and what the federal government should be doing?
Yeah, that's great. And I like sort of placing this in an international context because it has been interesting to see that the sort of, I'd say, the Anglo-Saxon cluster of governments has had a very similar trajectory in terms and some at various stages of development in tackling the procurement issue. I mentioned that the UK has done well in addressing these problems head on, so we can definitely look to that jurisdiction. But I mean, we can also look more broadly to countries that are now identified as sort of having leading digital government services. This includes Ukraine, Finland, Singapore, Estonia. Not, countries that we have historically always looked to for practices around, public sector governance. These jurisdictions are frankly nailing it when it comes to working with vendors, and they all tell a very similar story about how they're managing that. One is they're aggressively building their in-house IT expertise to build in-house when it makes sense, to be better shoppers, as we've already described, to oversee and manage, to ensure that when they work with vendors that those vendors want to send their A-team because they're like, we're going to be working with very talented technologists in government. And I think, this can be done through a mix of hiring and interchanges, but also through training. The other piece that I mentioned already is that it comes up in interviews that I've done with public servants, globally, asking them, like, how are you managing vendors and your digital government efforts? And they do often point to traditional public administration values and ethics. They have a culture of good governance. They're aware of the risks of conflict of interest, of cronyism, of revolving doors when they bring in technologists for, say, short-term stints working in government. So they manage that by, turning to classic tools of good public administration. They focus a lot on building kind of freeing internal rules, as we've already discussed, so that the public service can work in these ways, modern ways themselves, but also so that vendors can apply those methods when they work with the public sector. And then there's a really big emphasis on kind of modernizing procurement rules through things like modular contracting, spend controls, stronger information disclosure and reporting, prioritizing open source, but also some really interesting ways of thinking about procurement as a policy tool. So in certain jurisdictions, state IT procurement is tied to kind of national economic development. This something comes up a lot when you speak to Estonians or Finns, or in Ukraine, for example. There's a real emphasis on the state trying to build an ecosystem of local vendors having this economic growth opportunity attached to it, and also making a more competitive marketplace that can bid for government work.
Thank you very much. That is our time. Mrs. Vignola for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Clark, your paper lists a number of measures that could have avoided the current situation in Canada, where the majority of IT contracts are given are over to $2 million. What percentage of the 54% were successful contracts, were clear successes? And what percentage of the 54% have had results that are not known?
So this is a great question, and is one area where we were really kind of frustrated with the data available, is that we don't know whether those contracts led to value. We know from larger studies that larger contracts are more likely to lead to failure. So our assumption that those large contracts are problematic is based on that. But that is also the rule that, any other kind of government that is doing well on digital is following. So we don't know. We recommend in the paper adopting the open contracting data standard. These sorts of new ways of thinking about disclosure of contracting could include outcomes, which is really what you care about. If it costs $80 million, what did we get for that? This is an important question that we can't answer right now.
Merci beaucoup. Rapidement, une autre.
Thank you. Another quick question. In one article, and I don't have the source, but as I recall, there were a lot of layers of approval, and experts were saying that the system was dysfunctional and should be swept away so we could start from zero. Is that really what it will take to get things fixed? Perhaps should we create a Department of Government Procurement Streamlining?
About 30 seconds.
There is something exciting to say about doing a Control-Alt-Delete on current rules and then starting from fresh. That could be quite nice. And I think maybe that could be a good way to start. But certainly I think looking first at some of that internal public servant work around reducing red tape, that could be a great first step to streamlining what the internal rules look like.
Thank you very much. Ms. Blaney, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And I think I want to follow up a little bit because, what I heard very clearly is it's getting to be a problem to attract IT professionals that are very talented to the public service. And I'm curious if both of you could talk a little bit about why that is. And then to follow up on the question I had last round is what does government need to do to make it safer for public servants to actually have the space to be innovative? Because it sounds like part of the challenge right now is that innovation is being blocked. So what needs to be put in place to sort of nurture that rather than dissuade it?
I can briefly take the lead here. I think it's an excellent question, and I think it's something that in my own public service career is something that's very top of mind. Is how do we better enable public servants? How do we better empower them? How do we better equip them with tools? And as a outside of work side project, one of the websites I built several years ago was a website called "Is This Blocked in My Department?", which is a crowdsourced list of, as a public servant, depending on which department you're in, can you use Zoom? Can you use Trello? Can you use all these different software tools that teams around the world use all the time, but are often blocked or forbidden for public servants to use? So there's just an example of how really risk-averse public service culture holds public servants back and means that they're working the same way that they might have worked in the 90s, even though the rest of the world has moved on to much faster and effective ways of working. And I think there's a few challenges. One is that public sector IT salaries are competitive at the very lower levels and really not competitive at the top. And so if you're just, just leaving university or a college program to become like a help desk technician at the bottom level, that's a pretty good job. But if you're trying to hire some of the world's best cybersecurity experts, maybe you'll make $130,000 or $150,000 in the Canadian public service, and you'd make $400,000 Canadian working for a US tech company. And so because technology professionals can move between jobs and companies and even countries so easily, it's really hard to hire people that are world-class professionals, which when you're delivering services that millions of Canadians depend on, is actually very important. You don't need 1,000 of those people, but you need 5 or 10 that are really, really good, and there's no mechanism for the federal public service to be able to do that right now. The other challenge is that in government HR, the ability to move up the ranks without having to become a manager of other people is almost impossible. And even from sort of like the middle levels of the IT classification on up, you're expected to be managing a team, and that's the sort of criteria that you're judged on to be able to move even further up. And in modern tech companies, they realized decades ago that you're really great programmers, you're really great cybersecurity people. You don't want them to stop doing that and spend all their time managing HR conflicts and approving people's leave requests. You want them to just keep on doing that craft work that they're really good at. And so modern tech companies have dual track career progression frameworks, and those do not exist in the federal public service. And so we're taking our best people and saying, you're not going to touch a keyboard writing software code for the rest of your career. You're going to manage a team of 40 people and deal with all the HR drama that ensues. And that means that even if we were to pay people more, if we're asking them to be people managers when they really want to be great cybersecurity people or great programmers or great designers, we're not letting them do that. And there's just such an obvious fix that the Treasury Board has not done and has not prioritized, and is just really at odds with how the rest of the industry has evolved.
Thank you, Mr. Boots. We'll now go to Mrs. Block for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I join my colleagues in welcoming both of you back to committee. I know that you both have appeared, I believe, twice in November and then in November of 2022 and early January of 2023. And I just want to, recapture, I think, what we learned from you back then. I think we knew there was an issue when we put the Arrive scam issue on the agenda of this committee. But I think what I learned from you certainly is that government relies heavily on IT vendors and management consultants, and as you've stated again today, has done little to hire this expertise in-house and or train public servants. We also learned that it is hard to measure value for money or even how successfully completed a project is because of the ambiguous nature of how we collect data. And finally, that spending on external consultants is growing, and I think Mr. Boots has provided some great data in regards to that. Really quickly, you mentioned lucrative contracting opportunities for public servants, and so to you, Mr. Boots, as a former public servant, does all this contribute to public servants contracting with the Government of Canada to do work that they should be...
Sorry, Mrs. Block, I'm going to interrupt you for a second. Can you move your mic up a tiny bit?
Sure. Is that better?
Talk a bit more, please, and I'll let you know.
Okay, the question is, does all this contribute to public servants contracting?
Yes, that's better. Thank you.
With the Government of Canada to do work that they are already being paid to do in-house or should be paying to do in-house?
Thank you so much. I think it's a really interesting question. I would say off the bat that situations that we've seen in the news where public servants were simultaneously working for a department and then also running contracting companies, that was a huge surprise because I don't think that's a normal occurrence. But what does seem very normal is when you reach kind of like the mid to end state of your public service career in IT, it's very normal to go work for a large IT company, for a large IT vendor, because you have a lot of pre-existing relationships with your colleagues and counterparts. If you're a departmental chief information officer, you're probably never going to become an ADM, but you can make a lot of money going to go work for a large IT company, and you're all friends with all your other departmental CIOs that you used to work with. And so I think for those companies, it's very attractive for them to hire retired public servants who have a lot of pre-existing connections. And you see other things like large consulting firms running, demo days where they'll invite a lot of senior public servants to go see some cool things that new startups in Canada are doing, while they also gather a lot of notes on what they're then going to try to pitch back to departments to sell them some new management product or whatever, or IT product. So you do see those sorts of patterns. I think one way to fight that is to make it possible, like I mentioned earlier, to have a more successful long-term career that is sort of market competitive salaries while you're still in the public service. Because of course, I have friends who have left the public service to go make triple their previous salary working for a large tech firm. And of course, I left the federal government and I work for a provincial government. I'm still a public servant. I'm paid exactly the same as I was in my old job. And I'm very happy to sort of be able to play a role having a public impact. But for other people in different situations, it's very understandable that they go leave to make triple a salary. Like it's hard to say no to triple a 100,000 whatever salary, and that's an appealing thing. And that has consequences for this sort of somewhat cozy relationship that you see in news articles between the tech industry, or like the super large tech providers to government and the public service.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boots. Chair, I would like to use the rest of my time to move a motion that I put on notice last Friday, and I just want to read.
Let me interrupt for a sec. We're going to just distribute it to all the members right now. So go ahead, Mrs. Block.
I'll read it into the record. Given the government has spent $9 million of taxpayer money on a luxury condo located on Billionaires Row in New York City for the Consul General, the committee ordered Global Affairs Canada to produce a list within 14 days of this motion being adopted of all properties, including the addresses and listing prices of those that were visited or considered for purchase for the official residence of the Consulate General in New York. And the committee called the following witnesses to testify: Minister of Global Affairs, Melanie Joly; Consul General of Canada in New York, United States, Tom Clark; and the Deputy Minister of Global Affairs and other representatives from the department. And if I may just quickly speak to the motion that I've just read into the record, I think what has come to light over the past few years under this government's procurement practices is extremely disturbing, but perhaps not surprising. Whether it has been the hundreds of millions of dollars going to Liberal insiders or their friends at McKinsey getting special treatment in receiving government contracts, or former Liberal MPs and future Liberal leader hopefuls like Frank Baylis, whose company got a massive contract during the pandemic for ventilators that went unused, cost the government hundreds of millions of dollars only to be sold as scrap metal. We have seen the complete lack of spending controls on major procurements, including ArriveScam. And every step along the way, this government has tried to cover up these consequences of their failed governance. We know that they voted against the audit of the ArriveCan app, swearing that there was nothing to find.
Mrs. Block, I'm afraid your connection is breaking up again. Maybe move your mic a tiny bit up, and we might have to ask you to finish up, because again, we're having troubles. Translators are having troubles hearing you.
Thank you. I'll continue, and they can let me know if there's a problem.
And no, we're not able to hear you properly.
Well, that is extremely disappointing. I don't know what I can do from my end.
Yeah, unfortunately, the interpretation is not coming through at all. You're breaking up too much.
Thank you.
We're going to.
I'll move the motion.
Okay. Thank you. We'll start a speaking order. I have Mrs. Bignola.
Bonjour.
Hello. We are generally in agreement with the motion, but I would like to suggest a few amendments. We agree that $9 million for a New York condo for the consul is something that needs to be examined. $9 million for the average person is generally 9 lifetimes of work. It's quite a lot of money, and this is taxpayer money. It will be important to examine this in full. In the context of a federal budget, it may seem like a drop in the bucket, but it remains a sizable sum of money. So here's the amendment that I am suggesting. You will get it in a few seconds if you haven't gotten it already. Given that the government spent $9 million of taxpayers' money to purchase an apartment in Manhattan, New York, for the Consul General, the committee directs Global Affairs Canada to produce, within 14 days of the adoption of this motion, a list of all properties, including addresses and listing prices, that have been viewed or considered for purchase for the Consul General's official residence in New York. And the committee calls the following witnesses to testify: the Consul General of Canada in New York, USA, Tom Clark; the Deputy Minister of Global Affairs and other departmental representatives; representatives from PSPC and the Treasury Board, as well as a panel of New York City real estate agents; the Minister of Global Affairs, Mélanie Joly, if the committee deems it necessary after hearing the other witnesses; and that these meetings be held between August 19th and August 27th, 2024 inclusively, and that apart from these 3 additional meetings, the committee hold no additional meetings before September 9th, 2024, with the exception of the 106.4 meetings and the meeting scheduled for today, which we can take out that part because it's a moot point now. So with the exception of the 106.4 meetings, period. Thank you.
Speaking order on the amendment, I have Mr. Brock, and then Mr. Alhassi. Is your hand up for the amendment or the original motion?
Well, I had an opportunity to both listen.
No, I'm not asking. Sorry, I'm not asking you. Is your hand up for the motion or the amendment, please?
For the amendment.
Okay, so you'll be up to Mr. Brock. Before we go to Mr. Brock, though, just to confirm, Mrs. Vignola, basically your amendment is to add, and that these meetings will begin the week of August 19th, and apart from the 3 additional meetings, the committee hold no additional meetings before September 9th, with the exception of 106.4 meetings. Is that correct? You're just adding that one line at the...
Oui, ça ajoute cette modification-là.
Yes, it does add that paragraph on. The other change would be that the minister would only be invited if the committee deems it necessary after the other witnesses. We've done this in the past with other ministers. And for the Manhattan apartment, I think I mentioned Manhattan instead of Billionaires Row, just to be more specific.
To clarify, appreciate that. Mr. Brock and then Mr. Alhassi on the amendment.
Thank you, Chair. And at this juncture, the Conservatives will be voting in favor of the amendment. Owing to the technical difficulties experienced by my colleague, Ms. Block, and to complete the record, I wish to finish her thoughts. Whether it's their friends at McKinsey getting special treatment and receiving government contracts, or former Liberal MPs and future Liberal leader hopefuls like Frank Baylis, whose company got a massive contract during the pandemic for ventilators that went unused, cost the government hundreds of millions of dollars only to be sold as scrap metal. We've also seen the complete lack of spending controls on major procurements like the Arrive scam, an app that started with an $80,000 initial price tag, but ballooned to at least $60 million according to the Auditor General. And every step along the way, this government has tried to cover up these consequences of their failed governance. They voted against the audit of the ArriveCAN app, swearing that there was nothing to find. They swore there was nothing to find with the McKinsey contracting, yet each time malfeasance is found and has revealed a troubling pattern. Right before the House rose for the summer recess, it was reported that the government was purchasing a building right on Spark Street. No practical reason for purchasing this building was given in the articles, but they did note that, surprise, a good friend.
Sorry, Mr. Brock, we have a point of order. Mr. Jory?
My apologies, Chair. I believe we are debating the amendment to Ms. Vignola's motion, and I'm trying to understand the relevance. I just want to follow, and if it's relevant, I'm sure you will allow it. If we need to go back and focus on the amendment, I really appreciate that direction from you.
Yeah. Mr. Jory does have a point. We are debating the amendment, not the original motion. Perhaps if you just stick with the amendment, please, sir.
But did note, surprise, surprise, a good friend of the Prime Minister, Michael Pitfield, had part ownership of that building. Again, Conservatives are voting in favor of the amendment. Of all the buildings they could have purchased in Ottawa, they happen to buy one that directly benefits a close friend of the Prime Minister. Again, Conservatives are voting for the amendment. Now in New York, one of Trudeau's handpicked diplomats.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Mr. Alhassi?
You did point out correctly and accurately that this is about the amendment. So everything that the member is saying currently is irrelevant. Thank you.
He literally mentioned the amendment in the last 10 seconds.
I have. It's all irrelevant. I've got literally 30 seconds. If they want to continue to interrupt
They don't want
me,
to talk about Pitfield because Anna Gainey wants to
finish
be
up,
leader.
Mr. Brock, and then we'll go to Mr. Alhassi.
Thank you. Of all the buildings they could have purchased in Ottawa, they happened to buy one that directly benefits a close friend of the Prime Minister. Now in New York, one of Trudeau's handpicked diplomats just got a big upgrade in his residence. Trudeau has found it prudent to purchase an apartment on Billionaires Row for $9 million. Again, Conservatives are voting in favor of the amendment. This is how Trudeau's chosen elite live high on the taxpayer's dime at a time when Canadians are struggling to pay their mortgages or the rent. Again, Conservatives are voting in favor of the amendment. At a time when our country is seeing more tent cities cropping up across the country, at a time when 2 million plus Canadians are going to food banks to feed their families, and according to the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, more hurt is on the way with more defaults on the horizon as many Canadians are facing mortgage renewals over the next few years. Again, Conservatives are voting in favor of the amendment. Frankly, at a time when Canadians are living through housing hell, Trudeau is more interested in buying for and buying from his friends over delivering for Canadians. Conservatives believe that Canadians deserve answers, which is why Ms. Block brought forward this motion, which calls on the government. And I can't complete her thoughts on that, but that's my intervention. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Alhassi. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just on the topic of amendments, we certainly support the thrust of the amendments that have been proposed. I was just wondering if I could make some changes just to make sure that this committee can do its work properly. The first one would be.
Let me just interrupt you. You're proposing a sub-amendment, just to be clear?
Yes, correct.
Perfect. Go ahead, sir.
So I am proposing, first of all, just to refine it somewhat, that for the documents that have to be provided to the members, that we extend that from 14 days to 30 days. So that would be the first aspect of my sub-amendment. The second one, I understand that Ms. Vignola has proposed that we hear from relevant witnesses. That makes eminent sense. However, I was wondering if, in the interest of assisting the members, if all the members would agree to send in the names of those witnesses and for the deadline to be August 12th. So it would be adding relevant witnesses and submitting those witnesses by the members by the deadline of August 12th. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay,
speaking on the sub-amendment, we do have a rule, lack of better words, in the committee that amount of witnesses will be based on the percentage of the parties. So it's a pretty straightforward amendment there. The 12th seems pretty straightforward as well. But anyone wish to speak on the sub-amendment? The other issue that Mr. Hassasi's brought up is just the date of the documents. I see Mrs. Vignola.
Je remercie mon collègue.
I'd like to thank my colleague for his suggestions regarding the list of witnesses. Typically, we don't add that to motions. We figure it out informally at the end of a meeting. But I understand, and August 12th is a reasonable date. As for the documents, 30 days. Well, that means we would get them... Well, we might get them by the time the first witnesses take the floor, but we might not get them. We might not have an opportunity to read or analyze them. So, in my view, 30 days is too long to receive these documents. I understand that there are challenges with translation and interpretation. I get it. But I don't like to go on a fishing trip when I question a witness. I want to be able to base my reflections on something concrete, something I have analyzed. And if I don't have the documents before the first meeting, then the only thing I'll be able to do is go on a fishing trip and ask vague questions. Then I'll get documents after the fact and realize, oh, wow, the answers they gave were in the documents that I would have been able to read. I would have had better questions. So that would be a big waste of time, a waste of the witnesses' times. A waste of taxpayer money as well, because, of course, they're the ones who finance the work of this committee. So with efficiency in mind, I would not approve a 30-day deadline, because I would need to read the documents before the committee meeting. Personally, I cannot accept that sub-amendment. I apologize.
All right. Anyone else wish to speak on the sub-amendment? It sounds like committee seems to be fine with the first part, which is the witness, but not with the second. We can either just have a vote on the sub-amendment in its entirety, or perhaps if we're fine. Mr. Hassasi, go ahead.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chair. I had an opportunity to listen to Ms. Vignola, and I certainly understand and appreciate full well her concern. However, I don't think it would make sense for us to run the possible risk of not providing the department ample opportunity within 14 days to provide those documents. So God forbid, should that not prove possible, we would find ourselves in a very precarious position. And I really do think 30 days would make more sense, because the 30 days would not run. We do run the 30 days prior to the next meeting of the committee, but that's just an observation on my part.
Would we, I'm getting go ahead, Mrs. Vignola.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. I understand where my colleague is coming from. I do try to compromise, and I like to find an arrangement that would satisfy everyone around the table. I also want to respect the realities of public servants and translators, so I would suggest a friendly amendment.
Je dirais de changer le 30 jours.
Instead of 30 days, I would suggest 21. this would be partway between the original amendment and the sub-amendment. What do you think?
Thanks. I'm seeing nods around, but I do have Mr. Barrett wishes to speak on the sub-amendment.
So the motion, so I have a question for clarification. I want to ensure that the proposal with respect to witnesses, it just needs to be clearly understood by everyone that this is in addition to the witnesses that are prescribed in the motion. I need to understand that this isn't replacing because we don't have the sub-amendment in writing, that the sub-amendment does not remove the named witnesses being the Consul General, the Deputy Minister named, the representatives from Supply Canada and Treasury Board, Minister of Global, and the Minister of Global Affairs. So those witnesses need to still be included. I need to understand if that's what we're voting on. And further, if the meetings are to be held between the 19th and the 27th, whatever the date is that is being proposed, 21, 15, that we need to have an assurance through you, Mr. Chair, from the House that we're going to be able to have those documents translated for that first meeting of the committee. So that, to Ms. Vignola's original point, the documents need to be in our hands in both official languages prior to the opening of the window for these meetings to occur. And I need to just get some clarity that the named witnesses, in addition to the proposal for the submission of additional witnesses, that these witnesses remain, and that's in addition to those witnesses. The first question on if we set 21 days is the 14th, I think it would be by, say, noon. We should, I don't think it's a lot of documents, but you never know. So I can't say with absolute certainty, but probable, because I cannot imagine it's a lot. And being summer, I don't think there's a lot of requests going into the Translation Bureau right now. So not a certainty. Your second question is, you have the same understanding as I do, but Mr. Sassi can chime in. It's just to provide the witnesses by X date, but it's not to replace these witnesses, but to provide for the parties to provide witnesses by the, I think he said the 12th.
By the 12th, so it provides.
But it's not. But it's not replacing witnesses noted in the. Was that your intent?
No, it wasn't. But to the best of my understanding, it currently reads other relevant witnesses submitted by members.
So it's not replacing.
No, it's not replacing.
Yeah. So are we clear on the second part about the witnesses? The receiving the documents in the translation, it's always difficult. Again, we can't guarantee it because I don't know how many documents are going to arrive. If 5,000 pages arrive, just to exaggerate, within 14 days, they're not going to get translated, whether we say 14 days or 21 days. But there's not a lot going in the Translation Bureau right now, so I think we probably should be fine with that.
We can assuming they're not taking vacation.
Yes, assuming they're not taking vacation. So I would assume so, but nothing's a guarantee. And we wouldn't be able to guarantee if it was the 14th anyways. Or we wouldn't be able to guarantee if it was 31 days or 30 days, which was originally proposed.
But it is for the 14th? Is that what we're saying now?
14th as opposed to 14 days.
Right. So we're saying
so the 14th, yes.
The 14th. Okay.
Yeah. I'm sensing we're okay with that. We cannot do it as a friendly amendment, but we can adopt it as a UC, Mrs. Vignola's suggestion. And just to be clear, I'll have the clerk read back what the sub-amendment will be, with bringing in Mr. Sassi's comments on the witness date and the date of the documents. Just a sub-amendment.
So the sub-amendment is to replace after the words, or to add after the words, to produce within 21 days of the adoption of this motion, and after the other witnesses, that other relevant witnesses to be submitted by the parties by August 12th.
Straightforward. Everyone's clear on that?
Yes.
Fine. So we'll consider the sub-amendment adopted. We will now go to back to the original amendment, which, if you recall, is
Amendment as amended.
the sub-amendment.
Sorry,
Yeah, so
original
we're now
motion
back
as
to the
amended.
original amendment from Mrs. Vignola, which adds the dates for the meetings and ends other meetings. Bear with me 2 seconds. So we're adding Mrs. Vignola's, so we've accepted the sub-amendment. We're back to the original amendment from Mrs. Vignola, which is, and that these meetings be held between August 19th and 27th, 24 inclusively. Apart from these additional meetings, committee hold no additional meetings before September 9th, with the exception of 106-4s. And then also changes last line for the witnesses, the Minister of Global Affairs, Minister Jolie, if the committee deems necessary. So we're now back on that amendment. And I will go to Mr. McKinnon. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a concern that I'm not clear that the committee has the power to order, somebody to produce documents. I suspect that has to go to the House, and the House has to issue that order. I wonder if someone could clarify that. Perhaps the clerk could clarify that.
The committee does have the power to do that. I can have the clerk repeat what I said, and you're welcome to, sir. But committees, we've ordered, as members around this table know, hundreds of thousands of pages of documents. But if you wish to confirm that for Mr. McKinnon, sir.
Yes, the committee is within the rights to request production of documents.
I'm sorry, Mr. Clerk, I couldn't hardly hear you.
So yes, the committee can request the production of documents. Order.
Okay. Well, thank you for that clarification. In that case, I would like to propose a further sub-amendment. I believe that we should add to the documents we are requesting. We should request an independent third-party assessment of the value of the property that was purchased. And that would, I guess, that language would be in the appropriate place in the motion, probably after the residents of the Consulate General in New York.
I'm going to interrupt you, Mr. McKinnon. Maybe we could just restart that, because the committee cannot order money spent for a creation of an independent. If you're looking for the existence of one, maybe you could narrow it down to that, but we can't order an independent one done.
I'm suggesting that we need to see the value of this property that we purchased, and my suggestion is that we ask for for an independent third-party assessment of the value of that property in that market.
Yeah, that's not something that we can, again, order the government to pay for and have done. If you're asking for, if there's an existing one, we can ask for those an existing documents, but we can't order the government to spend money to have a consultant. Maybe GC Strategies is available to do it, but we can't order that to be. Sorry, we can't order that to be done.
I'm not requesting. I'm not suggesting that we order them to spend money. I'm asking that there be there is very likely an assessment that was made as part of the purchase. But that's my amendment, is to my sub-amendment is that after the official residence of the Consul General in New York, including if available, an independent third-party assessment of the value of the property in that market.
Who are you? Sorry, I'll hand it over to Mr. Bear and then Mrs. Vignola. But I want you to clarify, Mr. McKinney, who are you proposing does this independent? Because the committee can't order, even if we pass a motion, we can't order the government to perform an independent audit. We can ask if there's evaluations of it, or we can ask if there was one done. We can ask for those papers, if that's what you're asking for.
The language that I just said is that, and include, if available, an independent third-party assessment of the value of the property in that market. That does not order the government to spend any money, but that is my sub-amendment.
So just to be clear, the sub-amendment to produce these documents if it exists.
If available is what I said. I think it's important that we understand the value of the property. This is not an expense.
If there was an independent one done, we can ask for it if it exists. Not if it's available, if it exists. We can order it, the production of it. How's that? Are we on the same wavelength now, Mr. McKinnon? Basically, if one was done, we'll order the production of it. Correct?
I'm going to say I don't really like you rewording my motion or my amendment, but I will reword it a little bit. I'll say to add after the purchase for the official residence of the Consul General in New York, comma, and request, if available, any third-party independent assessment of the value of the property in that market. That should deal with your concerns.
Bear with us 2 seconds, Mr. McKinnon. Just making sure our clerk has what you've been asking for, Mr. McKinnon, so everyone's clear. I'm just going to read it back. The clerk's just going to read it back to Mr. McKinney. If you could let us know if we've collected it correctly from you.
So after New York, comma, add and request, if available, any independent third-party assessment of the value of the property in that market.
Yes, that would be sufficient.
Can we add within 21 days so we keep it with the same for the other documents?
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Did you still wish to speak on this, Mrs. Vignola? Okay, Mr. Barrett, Mrs. Vignola, and then Mr. Barrett, and then Mr. Brock.
Bon. Très rapidement, c'est...
Just very quickly, it's much more clear now. So if the government has carried out an analysis, we would like to have it. I think that was already included in the original wording where it talked about the documents, but sure, we appreciate the clarification.
Thanks, Mr. Barrett, then Mr. Brock.
Well, I fundamentally disagree with Mr. McKinnon that this is not an expense. His words were that this $9 million is not an expense, that $9 million in a cost of living crisis, in a housing crisis in our country, $9 million on a condo for Justin Trudeau's buddy Tom Clark on Billionaire Row, that $9 million is not an expense. Well, was it a gift Because if it, where did the how did that purchase come to pass? I mean, just absolute fantasy along the lines of budgets balancing themselves. Of course, $9 million is an expense, and it was taken out of Canadians' pockets. It was taxed off of their paychecks. So, of course, $9 million is an expense. And I'm pleased that the chair did heavily coach the amendment, because in its current form, it's supportable, though it wasn't in its original form. But we want all of the information about this $9 million expense that taxpayers are footing for the luxury condo for Justin Trudeau's buddy, Tom Clark, living on, quote, Billionaire Row in New York City. And I hope Mr. Clark enjoys it until the day after the next election.
The concern that I have, if anyone, I'm sure we've all dabbled in real estate in our personal lives, if not professional lives. There's always a cost attached to any assessment of fair market value. No, I understand that, Chair. I just want to complete my thoughts. There's always a cost to obtain an assessment. So in the ordinary course of events, the Liberal government, an agent of the Liberal government, would have negotiated the purchase of this extravagant, ultra-luxury penthouse on Billionaires Row for $9 million. There may or may not be an assessment that was made privy to the agent who purchased the property on behalf of the Government of Canada. But unless it's in the government's possession, even if one exists, the author of that assessment, unless they are a very generous individual or company, is highly unlikely to release it to the government to comply with this order without a cost. So unless the Liberal Party of Canada, which is in a position to pony up for a potential expenditure to comply with this particular order of committee, my concerns are it should not fall to the taxpayer.
Mr. McKinnon, is your hand up? Or is this just from the previous?
Yes, I just wanted to quibble about Mr. Barrett's comments. It's a purchase of a liquidatable asset. It is owned by the Government of Canada. It can be sold at some point, and presumably the value recaptured. It is definitely not an expense by any acceptable accounting process. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. And I also would suggest that we should ask or invite our witnesses to leave if they don't want to stay.
Well, maybe save that for your committee, Mr. McKinnon. I'm sensing we're getting close, so I'm hoping we might be able to get one more round in with the witnesses, because I want to hear more from them. Do we need to vote on Mr. McKinnon's sub-amendment? It sounds like, I think we're in a general agreement with basically providing those documents if they exist, as the clerk has read back.
We should send a green book over to his committee.
Yeah. Are we fine with that? Do we need to vote on it, or can we accept it as, I'm sensing we are accepting it. Unanimous consent. We are now back to the original, now amended motion. So we're back to the amendment. Do we need to, are we fine with this? Wonderful, that is accepted. So, and we're back now. The sub-amendment, amended motion. Are we fine with it, colleagues? Yes. Wonderful. I am glad we did not dismiss our witnesses. We are back to our speaking order. And no, I'm sincere, because I'm finding the time with Mr. Boots and Ms. Clark fascinating. So I'm very, very happy that we can have them for a bit longer. We're back to, actually, Mr. McKinnon, you are up now for for 5 minutes with Professor Clark and Mr. Boots. Go ahead, sir.
Excellent. Well, it turns out I'm glad we didn't release them as well. Dr. Clark, you mentioned a number of countries who have this problem nailed. I wonder if you could give us kind of the top three in order of how they would be most useful for Canada to model.
Yeah, I don't know if I can kind of rank the top three, like just off the top, but I'd say when I look at countries that are generally succeeding in the quality of their digital services and their digital modernization, vendor management and IT kind of contracting is a big part of their strategy, because like clearly the answer here is not for everything to be built in-house. There's lots of room, and there has to be room to have healthy relationships with these outside providers. So I mentioned a few examples of countries that are doing interesting work in this space. I'll offer up a few that come to mind. I know in Singapore, and speaking with a public servant there who works on their digital government initiatives, they have a practice of making sure that whenever they work with a larger vendor that may not be local for a local firm, that they have like clauses in the contract which say that they have to bring along local firms to kind of give them the opportunity to work on a government project to help sort of infuse more local economic development and foster a really strong local tech ecosystem. I think on the point around bringing in strong tech talent, we talked a fair bit already about sort of the issues of like just the salary disparities. And so countries that are succeeding at bringing in that kind of talent to senior roles are taking some of the measures that Mr. Boots mentioned around, not strictly forcing these people into managerial roles when that's not where their passion and talent lies, but also really emphasizing the kind of the public mission of government. This is something that comes up constantly in interviews with technologists who choose careers in government despite the lower pay, is that it's like really rewarding and meaningful to actually improve your country and help people get services that work. So pushing that message is really powerful and has worked very well in the United States, for example, and in the United Kingdom in bringing in technologists. I think thinking about, we talked a bit about the problems of revolving doors and, like sashaying from a career in government into these firms and that creating opportunities for perhaps sort of like inappropriate contracting. I also think we really want to nuance that to note that we do still want to encourage a kind of fluid interchange between the private sector and government, acknowledging that it may not be realistic for those who have lucrative opportunities in the private sector to work an entire career in government. So making it easier to have more of those interchanges and building up a really strong culture of like seeing those outside players as not strictly the enemy and having strong rules and good organizational hygiene internally so that when you do have that back and forth, that you don't worry as much. You don't need to be as concerned about conflict of interest or cronyism. This comes up, for example, when I was speaking with public servants in Estonia, kind of globally recognized digital leader, they see the boundary between public and private as pretty fluid, and partially that's because they are a tiny nation and it's a small community. But when I ask them, like, well, aren't you worried about those folks like leaving government and then using that to get career, like to build the profit of a firm? And they say, we all know each other. We have a high level of trust. We have strong rules in place and a very strong culture of good governance. So these are some of the things we want to focus on building in Canada. I think there's tons more. The spend controls that I mentioned, I think, are needed in this case, just as a hard stop on bad practices. That's another one. And yeah.
So Singapore and Estonia. Singapore is a small island. Estonia is very small. The problems, seems to me the problems there are quite different than dealing with a large country like Canada with our vast geographical areas and communication issues and so on and so forth. Do you really think that those countries provide a solid model for us to follow?
That Mr. Boots, yeah, go for it.
Sure, yeah, if I could jump in. There's some other really interesting examples that relate to the question of who owns the software that's being built through government IT contracts around intellectual property, and the use of open source software, that different countries have done really interesting things. And a couple of examples of this that are maybe a bit more comparable to the Canadian kind of geographic and sort of context are both Germany and France. The government of France, maybe a decade ago, in legislation declared that essentially all technology products bought and used by the federal government or by the national government in France needed to be open source. And the term open source, I think, often makes you think of, geeks in the basement of a university, like in the basement writing code. But open source software is widely used by the private sector tech industry, by governments and universities and organizations all around the world. And it helps get around the situation where you bought a product from a commercial software vendor that only they provide, and then you're just stuck with them for decades, which often happens with government technology products, where we spent millions of dollars on a product from one vendor, and getting away from them is too difficult because they're too entrenched. That's a systemic problem that shows up a lot. And so France has legislation that says when we're paying companies to build software for us, it needs to be reusable. It needs to be licensed under a sort of agreement that lets other departments in other parts of the government or other countries even use it. So that's really important. And Germany has recently launched what they call the Sovereign Technology Fund, which is essentially government funding to build digital software products that can be reused across the German government and across other governments around the world, so that you're not paying for the same software over and over again. And there's this idea that just like bridges and airports and ports create sort of an infrastructure on which the economy functions, government-owned or open-source government-used software creates an infrastructure layer that lets services be delivered more efficiently, at a lower cost, more reliably. There's a lot of interesting work happening to make software reusable. And I think for Canada, you could imagine a future government introducing something like a Don't Pay for the Same Software Twice Act that sort of enshrines this idea that if we're paying for some company to build a brand new piece
I have to ask you to wrap up, Mr. Boots. Sorry.
No problem.
Thanks.
It's a topic I'm a little bit too passionate about, so I appreciate the question a lot. Thank you.
When we bring the two of you back, if you'll come back, when you produce your paper, I think we'll do an extended meeting just so we can have some more time for this. We're going to do our final set of interventions. I have Mr. Barrett for 5, please.
So, Ms. Clark, when we left off, I had asked you about ministerial accountability, because we have seen a situation where situations like the Trudeau Liberals Arrive scam saw companies like GC Strategies, a 2-person operation working out of a basement, adding no value. Supposedly, they were to source resources to work on the project. But we learned from KPMG, which is a huge company, that KPMG was instructed by the public service that they would need to be a subcontractor of GC Strategies, adding 30% to the cost of it. And there would be many of these cases. So is the problem that no one is in charge anymore, and so there's no one actually trying to evaluate whether we're getting value from these contractors, big or small? Because as you said, though the larger companies are the most successful in winning the bids, they're not necessarily providing the best value for money. And value for money is a whole other conversation that we'll save for another day, because there are far too many cases where, as the Auditor General has noted, we don't get value for money with the Trudeau Liberals procurement process.
Mm-hmm. So I think the point around holding ministers to account for these kinds of failures is really important, and something that we've seen in other jurisdictions where we've had massive change in thinking about how to work with vendors and how to manage digital initiatives more generally. It's usually because there's been a big political scandal and somebody's was on the line, someone and was held to account, and there was a clear point of ministerial kind of ownership. This is a challenge in the Canadian case in that we have muddied ownership of all these questions, right? So you've got, first of all, many departments involved, like Public Services and Procurement Canada, Treasury Board. Now we have the Minister of Citizen Services, Shared Services. ESDC is an owner of many of these, so how do we like to move beyond just a specific question of what happened with ArriveCAN, I mean, when there is a kind of an IT failure, it can be really hard to locate like who to blame, but also who's then sitting around the cabinet table feeling like I'm responsible for and I own this. When we had a Minister of Digital Services in the past, we no longer have that role. I'm not sure that was necessarily the answer to this problem, but one thing that I think would be important to think about in sort of future machinery of government configurations is like, how do we create a clear locus of responsibility and accountability that is like answering questions in question period and actually can access the information they need to be responsible? Because this is, of course, the other challenge around ministerial accountability on this particular file is that their ownership is so distributed and the decisions are happening on so many different ways that it's really hard to know who would be reasonably blamed for these things.
Well, and they shuffle the deck chairs on the Titanic so often that it's hard to know whose seat is whose. They've had 4 PSPC ministers in 4 years, so it's really tough. They've created a situation intentionally to make it harder to hold individual ministers to account. And this Prime Minister has established a system where no one is held responsible in spite of their failures. He doesn't fire the ministers when they break ethics laws, and he doesn't fire them when they fail Canadians. You know, there's a list of 2-person middlemen companies like GC Strategies, and there seems to be dozens of them. Solutions Moray Incorporated had 2 employees. They've got $78 million in contracts. Mesa Computing, 1 employee, $34 million. Mobile Resources Group, 1 employee, $28 million. Access Corporate Technologies, 2 employees. They got $9 million. Hackett Consulting, 1 employee, $8 million. They must have been really working overtime. What real value have they provided to Canadians for these hundreds of millions of dollars? Isn't it easy to say that they've provided no value?
You know, I think I don't know what each
please.
of those firms has done. I haven't looked at the individual contracts or what their deliverables were, so I really can't comment on the value for money. But I will say, sort of looking to the patterns we saw in the data, that we have very good reason to believe that the kind of pooling of contracts in a small number of firms, and also the general practices around how we manage IT procurement suggests that there would not be value for many of the IT contracts that we're striking, just even at the basic level of how much money is going into each of those individual contracts.
Thanks. Sassy, please go ahead for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to share my time with MP McKinnon. MP McKinnon.
Thank you, Mr. Asasi. So I want to talk to Mr. Boots about earlier on in the meeting we heard that it projects too big to succeed are our problem. We need smaller projects, particularly with software. And you emphasized that it's not so much about the projects, but about the contracts. We need smaller contracts. In less than $3 million, less than $2 million or so, and 3 years. So it occurs to me, though, that this kind of sidesteps the issue. If you have a large project in which you have some number of smaller subcontracts, that you still have a large project, and someone has to define that project. Someone has to analyze the components of it, and then allocate those. So is this not? Creating a whole number of subcontracts with, of less than $2 million and so forth, doesn't really solve the problem. We will probably have a larger overall project that is substantially more.
Yeah, it's a good perspective. I think it's, in some ways, that's sort of an illustration of the internal, the burdensome barriers that exist for public servants that are trying to get a procurement or an RFP out the door. It is so much work and so time-consuming to go through all of the sort of paperwork steps to get there. And that's one of the reasons that public service teams are so incentivized to, instead of having 5 small contracts, they'll just have one enormous contract with one of the really large vendors, who then will probably get a bunch of subcontractors and do work that's really hard to keep accountable. I think breaking things into smaller contracts, like Professor Clark spoke about, is a way of being more accountable to if those contracts are actually delivering good value. If it's a contract for $2 million for 6 months for some team and they do a bad job, you can drop them and move to the next vendor. Whereas if you have a 5-year-long contract for $30 million with one company, even if they're doing a terrible job 2 years in, you're probably still stuck with them because it's too hard to extricate yourself. And so breaking the thing into smaller pieces, into smaller contracts, is a way of improving the quality of outcomes. And around the sort of overall cost of even large IT projects, I think one of the things that the private sector technology industry shows us is that you can have a massively popular product, software product, used by millions of people for like a fractional cost more than if it was only used by a few people. So, for example, if you're the team that launched Instagram 10 or 15 years ago, you probably had a team of 5 software developers. You built Instagram. The cost of running that team that built Instagram is the same if it had 2 people using it or if it had 300 million people using it. And the only differential cost is a little bit of cloud sort of computing infrastructure that doesn't really cost much money nowadays. And so the team of people building it is the most expensive part, regardless of how much it's used. And that way of thinking really hasn't internalized itself into government software, where the idea is this is used by millions of people. We need 1,000-person team of contractors working on it. And the truth is you could build an equally high-quality product with a team of 10 or 15 at a fraction of the cost. And there's some great writing from Waldo Jaquith in the United States. I don't know if we've mentioned his work before, but he has a great piece about Scrum team years, which is around this sort of assumption that a large IT project in government surely must cost $50 million. And his question is, what are you actually getting for $50 million? A lot of paperwork. The team that's actually building the software that people will use, you might need one team, that might be $1 million a year. You might need 2 teams, that's $2 million a year. The costs are actually much lower than people are accustomed to in government IT. And there's just this normalized idea that it's a large project affecting a lot of people. It must cost a lot. And it's hard to question that when that's this sort of established thinking on these types of projects.
But you're still not committing to a large project that is substantially more than $2 million. And within that context, it's going to be up to the vendor to decide how to manage it, whether to break that down into small sub-projects.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the thing that is a sort of cautionary tale once you're trying to break a large project into small ones is this idea of false incrementalism. And sometimes you see an idea where you'll take a large project and you'll say, here's phase 1, here's phase 2, here's phase 3, here's phase 4. And the question that anyone in a leadership position should be asking is, when we did that, is it still useful if we only ever did phase 1 or 2? If we still just stopped there, would it still add public value? And of course, if you're delivering software on a regular basis and actually shipping it out the door for the public to use, to get feedback, for people to actually benefit from it, then it's still useful after only 1 phase or only 2 phases. But if it's a 5 or 10 phase project that's only useful at the very end 5 years later, you haven't actually broken it down, you've just given little labels to it. So actually shipping something out the door for the public to use, that's the real defining factor between genuinely breaking things into smaller pieces or false incrementalism where it looks like you did, but it's not actually benefiting the public.
Thanks very much. We'll go to Mrs. Vignola, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Chair. Ms. Clark, in 2022... Oh, I'll let you put your earpiece on there. Thank you. In 2022, it was estimated that at least 7,500 people working for the government were earning at least $14,000. I believe it was you who came up with those numbers. Some were earning $2,800 a day. First question. Do these salaries reflect what is done in the private sector?
So do public sector salaries reflect the salaries that private sector consultants would make?
Dans le fond, les 7,700 consultants informatiques.
The 7,700 IT consultants are consultants. They were hired by the government, and they earn, on average, $1,400 a day as contractors. If they were working for a private company, would they be earning that same daily amount or less or more?
Yeah, I don't actually have the data on that to know what the average sort of consulting fee is for private sector. I think it's a good question though, right? To investigate whether it's like more lucrative to work as a consultant with government versus contracting with a private firm. One thing that we did find really interesting, and the Auditor General has been helpful here, was in bringing out some of the sort of trying to understand like how much we pay on average a day for a contractor versus an in-house government employee, and it is quite striking actually how much more expensive it is. Again, it's not to say that everything should be in-house, and there's nuance there, and some roles like should probably be in-house, like a product owner, for example. I've mentioned Finland a few times. They don't have any coders in-house. They just outsource all of that. So there's an efficiency of like what type of role as well.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, vous avez répondu à ma
Thank you. You anticipated my second question. Federal public servants are not paid those huge amounts. When you look at the difference between a public servant and a contractor, could you explain that difference in payment by the fact that there could be a number of in-between levels?
Pause the time. We're just having issues with translation.
Oh.
Yeah, no problem there. Are the differences between these salary differences between consultants and public servants, can they be explained by the fact that there's a number of different layers of subcontractors who are saying, I'm going to pick this guy, he's going to pick that guy, and everyone adds money onto that total? Could that make up the difference?
I mean, possibly. We didn't look at that. We didn't have data around that in our research. So it's a good question. Mr. Boots, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
Yeah. One difficulty there is that if there's a per diem for consultants, part of it would go to the company itself. It's really hard to say what amount of money goes to which level of the process, if there is a process with multiple levels, as you were saying, between the company hired and the person doing the actual work. Thank you. Very quickly, Ms. Clark, earlier you mentioned that people who are skilled in programming and IT are not necessarily interested in becoming managers and signing paychecks. But would they be interested in becoming technical managers? So people who are specialized in contracting. Basically what I'm saying is, should there be two levels of manager, technical ones and HR ones?
Yeah, I mean, I think we looked at it in terms of the career progression in the private sector and what's, you can continue to move up through the ranks in a tech firm, for example, getting, more seniority, better pay, while still doing the technical work. Whether your point is sort of, if I'm understanding, whether there could be like a sort of more technical managerial route versus, I mean, I hadn't thought about that. And Mr. Boots probably has, or at least has thoughts on how that could be operationalized based on what you've seen with your colleagues, because you did work, he worked very closely with tech talent in government that could have, run off to the private sector as well.
Yeah, avoir ces deux trajectoires.
Having those two career paths, HR manager on one path and IT manager on the other. Well, I think that would actually be a step in the right direction. Also, IT is varied. There's a help desk in there. There's low-level employees, and then there's people who are hyper-specialized in very specific things, like cloud computing, for instance. Within IT, in the public service, we need to review the classification system. Software developing specialists and cybersecurity specialists should be handled in one way, and then more traditional IT, like the help desk and team management, could be managed a different way. It might be advantageous to split the IT classification into. This would help with hiring, for example, and ensuring everyone has competitive salaries.
Blaney, you're batting cleanup for us today. The floor is yours, please, to finish us off.
Well, thank you so much, Chair. I appreciate that. I think this has just been so fascinating as a member who isn't often on this committee. I really have to say I've really enjoyed what I've learned. One of the questions, and I'm asking both of you because you both have different expertise on this issue, is finding that right balance between in-house and contracting out. I mean, that's come up a lot. And I'm just wondering, how should we consider that being measured? What do we need to assess in that process? Because I think, you know, I will say for the public service, like they are on the precipice of defending taxpayer dollars and how it's spent. This is obviously not going very well right now. So I'm just wondering, what kind of policy do we need to really find that balance of in-house, and what is the justification behind it? Because I think when we look at a lot of these issues, the problem is, until there's a crisis, this is very hard to explain to people who vote in our country. And we want Canadians to have a better understanding of why we're doing what we're doing when we're in government. And so if you could give us a little bit of thoughtfulness around that, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's like some nuance, and I don't think there is a clear rule yet on like what the ratio is between, you know, in-house versus outsourced, and there's different approaches. As I mentioned, you know, some governments really emphasize a sort of fluid back and forth. They don't really, I mean, their focus is on kind of a core of IT expertise in particular roles. So the product ownership role is one. So is something that is sort of regularly cited to me as something that needs to be brought in-house. I think senior leadership and empowered sort of like proven technologists who've like produced high quality services and like putting those folks into kind of deputy minister rank positions where they can actually influence how the rest of the work in their department unfolds. That seems to be an area where focusing on in-house is really, really important. I think there's like scope to think about across departments, like how you could kind of, we work right now with the Canadian Digital Service as something we haven't talked about yet today, but that is an important like tool that we could greater kind of use across the federal public service to bring in tech talent. And so many governments start out this journey of like reskilling or upskilling by creating these small digital service teams at the center. And then over time, departments create their own digital service teams. And the idea is that you can pass on these methods and try to kind of retrain internally. But there is no golden rule for how much of the work should be sent out to others to do and what should be kept in-house, with the exception, as I say, of regularly the product ownership role comes up. And then I would say the other one that regularly comes up when I speak to public servants about this issue is that they feel very strongly that sort of policy, vision, strategy, the objectives of a digitization initiative, that should be internal. And then the kind of the footwork like can be fruitfully outsourced. And then that there's certain other areas where it's just not going to be reasonable to keep that expertise on hand, like the latest expertise in artificial intelligence or cybersecurity. Like this might be something where we want to kind of turn more to external advisors, but have a sufficient base of knowledge internally to be able to ask good questions and really scrutinize the advice they provide.
Yeah, I think sort of adding to that, I think the two kind of principles, kind of regardless of what that ratio is, and I think we agree that it should be at least considerably more in-house tech talent than the current ratio. But I think regardless of what the sort of perfect ratio might be, I think the two principles that to me come to mind are, for technology products to succeed, you need better feedback loops. And part of that is public service culture, where it's really hard from like the ground level on up. It's hard to share bad news up the chain. You can imagine stories about Phoenix where people, with their hands on the keyboards were like, wow, this is totally going to blow up. And of course, as that goes up the chain, it gets watered down every time where, the project manager above them is like, we're dealing with some issues, but it'll totally turn out better. And the layer above them says, aside from a few things, it seems great. And by the time it gets to deputy minister, it's like glowing green lights all across the board. And so figuring out ways to sort of short circuit the lag time and the telephone tag that happens between, the technology folks doing the work and the decision makers 8 or 9 layers above them, trying to short circuit that, I think, is really important. And the other angle is, like Professor Clark mentioned around ministerial accountability in technology products in the federal government, it is so diluted and so diffuse where any given project has so many external dependencies. And so that's, for example, you've got the team building the product, you've got their contractors, you've got shared services doing some things, you've got TBS needing to get reports on other things. And it is so hard to say, here's the team that's ultimately accountable at the end of the day, here's the director, here's the ADM, here's the deputy minister, here's the minister. It's just so diffuse. And that, I think, is something where the more that you can reduce external dependencies, the more likely your project is to succeed. Like, cut SSE out of it, cut other groups out of it, just have a good team and do the work and fend off everyone else for as long as you can.
Wonderful. That is our time. Mr. Boots, Professor Clark, thank you sincerely so much for your time, your patience with us. I do encourage you, if you have any reports, any links that you wish to share, any documents, please send them in to the clerk. We'll get them translated and sent out to the members. I assure you they will be very welcomed. And we look forward to perhaps welcoming you back again when you have your report or your papers published. Thank you again, sincerely. We are adjourned.